Is it Gandalf in The Hobbit? No, it's one of the dwarves, isn't it, who first arrives, whether it's Balin or can't remember who comes first.
Start falling on top of each other. Okay. Okay, let's see. So I can see us on YouTube, which is encouraging. Good. Yep. Okay. We are live on YouTube now as well. So I think this is time to start. We are ready to go. Okay. So I'm going to kick us off. So welcome everyone. My name is Dimitra Fimi, and I'm co-director of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here at the University of Glasgow. My specialism is on fantasy and children's literature, so you can imagine how tremendously excited I am for today's event that brings together both of those things in C.S. Lewis's Narnia and Katherine Langrish's marvelous, moving and original book, From Spare Oom to War Drobe, Travels in Narnia with My 9-year-old self. So you will hear a lot more about Katherine, Narnia, and the power of mythopoeic fantasy in a bit. But let me first welcome you all on behalf of the Centre and go through a few housekeeping things. Okay, so first of all, the structure of the event is as follows. My colleague and co-director, Dr. Robert Maslen, will introduce Katherine Langrish in a minute, and then Katherine will do a reading from her book before we launch into questions. From me and Rob first, sorry, you're going to have to let us go first, and then from all of you. For your questions, please use the Q&A function, and please free to use the chat function to, as you're doing already, to register reactions and to share thoughts you know, all of the usual activity that happens during events. But with so many of us present, it's much easier for us to monitor the Q&A for questions. So please try to stick to that if you want questions directed to Katherine. And since I mentioned the chat, I know some of you have already been doing this, but do please feel free to let us know where in the world you are as you're watching this. And those of you watching on YouTube, you can do the same via the comments section. If you want to live tweet or share on social media about the event, please use the hashtag Spare Oom to War Drobe and or hashtag Narnia, and please tag U of G Fantasy, and I will put all of those in the chat in a minute. So without further ado, I'm now passing on the baton to my colleague, Dr. Rob Maslen, to introduce our guest, Katherine Langrish.
Well, it's a huge pleasure to welcome Katherine to the Centre, even if we're only able to do it virtually. So I'm going to give you a few bits of information about Katherine that many of you will already know, but it's a good starting point. So after taking a first degree in English, Katherine studied medieval literature at University College and King's College London, after which she worked for several years in the information office for Lloyd's Register. After moving to France and then the United States, she became interested in oral storytelling, and for a few years was involved in telling stories to children in schools and libraries. She tells us on her website that research for her various projects has been very exciting. So that might be something you might want to ask about. Feeding wolves, crawling down mines, messing around on the Thames in an inflatable boat, swarming over castles, and even spending a week in Denmark, learning how to sail a reconstructed Viking ship on Roskilde Fjord. She currently lives in Oxfordshire, which you can see in the picture, and with her husband and a Dalmatian dog called Polly, who you also might get to see on the picture if you're very lucky. Her books include the Viking trilogy, Troll Fell, Troll Mill, and Troll Blood, Forsaken, which is based on the Danish legend behind Matthew Arnold's wonderful poem, The Forsaken Merman, and Dark Angels, or The Shadow Hunt, which is about ghosts, elves, and hobgoblins, and is set in the Welsh Marches at the end of the 12th century. As an essayist, she has contributed essays and reviews to various academic publications, including a brilliant essay on the children's books of Mervyn Peake for Miracle Enough of 2012, which is the first piece of hers I ever read, and an essay on Alan Garner for Erika Wagner's 2016 celebratory anthology, First Light. Most recently, she's published the book 7 Miles of Steel Thistles, which is a collection of essays on fairy tales and folklore based on the amazing blog that she started in 2009. So do make sure that you go and have a look at the blog after the event today, and enjoy some of those books if you can, as soon as you can. So I'm going to begin then by asking, well, continue, I should say, as the next thing, by asking Katherine to read us something from Spare Oom to War Drobe, to give us a sense of what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for that amazing introduction, which makes me sound far more interesting and important than I feel, but thank you anyway. I've chosen to read a little bit from the beginning of my chapter on the silver chair. So I will begin without more ado. The Silver Chair was the very first Narnia book I ever read. My mother gave it to me for Christmas when I was 8, along with about 6 other books, most of them probably by Enid Blyton. All I ever asked for was books, but I didn't like the look of this one. The picture on the cover showed a gloomy-looking cavern filled with a lot of grotesque little gnomes, and it put me right off. I had no idea what the story might be about, but it looked downright sinister. The gnomes reminded me of Gollum in The Hobbit, a book which I'm sorry to say had given me the creeps. And worse still, of the Hobbies, a truly ghastly fairy tale, inexplicably included in my school reading book, in which the nasty little goblin Hobbies cut all 4 legs of a faithful dog. So naturally, I put off reading this new horror. I read my Enid Blytons, and I seem to remember Elizabeth Goodge's The Little White Horse. And with nothing else left, and I was the sort of child who reads the back of cornflakes packets if there's nothing else, I reluctantly opened the Silver Chair and began. And you know, it started quite manageably after all. It was a dull autumn day and Jill Powell was crying behind the gym. It sounded like a school story, but almost immediately the narrator went on to say it wasn't a school story. And then Eustace Scrubb, whoever he was, came along to tell Jill there's this chance of escaping the bullies of Experiment House by using magic to get into another world. But just as they're trying some kind of incantation, the bullies find them and they have to run. The school grounds are surrounded by a high stone wall with a door that opens onto moorland. And though the door is kept locked, it's occasionally been found open. Well, it does open, not onto dull English moorland, but onto bright sunshine and clear air on a high mountain. And then Jill shows off at the edge of a cliff, and Scrubb grabs her, and they struggle, and he falls. And suddenly a great lion rushes to the cliff edge and blows him to Narnia, as steadily as a vacuum cleaner sucks in. Now, since I'd never met Maslen before, I was as taken aback as Jill. Nor did this lion seem particularly friendly. He refuses to give her any assurance that he won't eat her. In fact, he remarks with unhelpful indifference that he has swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms, which is disconcerting to say the least. Jill dares to drink from the stream he's guarding though, and when the lion asks what has happened to the boy, she tells him the truth. Eustace fell because she was showing off at the cliff edge. The lion approves of this honest answer and tells her that Eustace is safe, but that their task will be more difficult because of what she has done. Jill and Scrubb's job is to find a lost prince and bring him back to his father's house. And the lion gives her 4 signs. First, as soon as Eustace arrives in Narnia, he will meet an old friend whom he must greet at once. Second, the 2 children must journey north out of Narnia to the ruined city of the giants. Third, in this ruined city, they will find a writing which they must obey. Fourth, and most important, when or if they find the lost prince, they will recognize him because he will be the first person in their travels who asks them to do something in the lion's own name, the name of Aslan. So there I was in this adventure full of old castles and dying kings, snowy moors and talking owls, and Puddleglum the marsh-wriggle, the best pessimist since Eeyore, and the beautiful Belle Dame sans Merci style green witch, with time running out to save Prince Rilian in that terrible engine of sorcery, the silver chair. I was hooked. This colourful, colloquial fairy tale was the best story I ever read. And each Narnia book has its own flavour. There's the Snow Queen winter world of the lion, the mystical Celtic voyage tale of the Dawn Treader, the E. Nesbit style of the magician's nephew, the Arabian Nights adventure of the horse and his boy. With its quest element and snowy winter journey over rough northern countryside, I now see parallels between the Silver Chair and the medieval English poem Gawain and the Green Knight, while the supernatural lady of the Green Kirtle seems derived from the beautiful but dangerous fairy queens of ballads like Tam Lin and Thomas the Rhymer. And in fact, there's a powerful magical woman called the Dame of the Fine Green Kirtle in a Scots fairy tale, which Lewis may well have known, the fair Gruagach, son of the King of Erin. And here I'm going to just depart from the text a little, because even though Spare Oom is complete and published, I've carried on thinking about the Seven Chronicles, and I'm not sure I put enough emphasis, although we've had a little discussion before we started talking, and I'm sure that I have. But I wasn't sure I totally and sufficiently emphasized how much the character of Aslan himself changes from book to book. In The Lion, the Witch and the War Drobe, he's extremely physical, incarnate, friend and redeemer. He doesn't manifest, he's there. If he wants to go somewhere, he walks there or runs there. He doesn't vanish and reappear. In The Horse and His Boy, he barely appears until very near the end, when it turns out he's ordained and controlled nearly everything that happens. He's a remote high church figure, caring, but also stern and even retributive. In Prince Caspian, he again arrives late in the book. He can't at first be seen except Lucy's eyes of faith. He appears and disappears and acts as a destroying elemental force to the usurping Telmarines. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I've come to think he's actually the joyful manifestation of the Holy Spirit, swooping in and out of the tale like a swallow, taking the shapes of albatross, lamb, a picture in a spell book, a plaque on the wall. And he can even be seen in the Eastern Ocean and yet be in Cair Paravel by nightfall. In The Silver Chair, he is powerful and good, but remote. He appears in person only at the very beginning and the very end, and his role is mainly that of absent lawgiver, and of course Redeemer. He resurrects Caspian at the end. And in the last battle, he's simply absent. He's not there until the very, very end. So absent, in fact, over so many years, that Shift the Ape is able to perpetrate his deceit. Narnia is full of people who have never, ever seen Aslan. He has never been there in their lifetimes, perhaps even in their fathers' and mothers' lifetimes. And the conversation in Narnia is about when will we see him? Will he ever come back? And of course, when he does appear, it's on Narnia's Day of Judgment to bring the world to an end and reveal himself as God. So I do think that the Narnia books are very, very diverse and very, very interesting. And I'll stop there. And that's a sort of taste of the book.
That's great. Thank you ever so much, Catherine. That was absolutely lovely. And it's really poignant that you start with, you start as we're reading from the book that you started, you know, your whole Narnia adventure. So it was really nice. And can I start then with the first question, which is really about, I mean, that's very predictable, but I'm sure everybody's curious about it, and I am for one. I'd like to know a little bit more about the origins of the book and what prompted this this dual reading of recapturing your childhood reading on the one hand, but then also juxtaposing it with the adult reader's perspective at the same time. How did the whole adventure start of writing this book?
Well, the whole series, I began by writing a series of essays on my blog, which is called 7 Miles of Steel Thistles. Because on that blog, I write or blog about fantasy, fairy tales and folklore. And I think perhaps I've been doing a lot of folklore, a lot of fairy tales, and it struck me that fantasy, and for some reason, I realized that I hadn't picked up the Narnia books for about at least 20 years. I'd tried reading them to my own children when they were younger, and they sort of enjoyed them, but hadn't been swept away. And this was the Harry Potter era, and they were very, very keen on Harry Potter, which is fine. But I remembered how very, very much they meant to me when I was a child. And I thought perhaps it would be interesting to revisit them and reread them and find out whether I felt the same way about them as an adult. So each, I think I've forgotten, I don't think, I may have begun with The Lion, the Witch and the War Drobe, I probably did. And it was quite a short piece. And as I continued through the series, the essays grew longer and more intricate, and more, because I got more and more interested in this. And so I think the idea of comparing my impressions now with my impressions as a child had been there from the very beginning. And my memories of reading these books are very, very strong because they meant so very much to me. I was one of those children who, I couldn't bear the idea that Narnia wasn't real. In some sense, it had to be real. I didn't really notice the Christian symbolism. And when I said to my mother once, rather sort of tentatively, do you know, it almost feels as though Narnia might be real. God bless her, she didn't say, oh, don't you realize, you know, this is the story of Christ sort of transformed into that of a lion. She just said, I think you're meant to feel that way. Which is wonderful. So
That's a very good answer.
Yeah, it left me alone to make my own discoveries, which I think was very wise. But having been given the first book, I think when she must have chosen The Silver Chair for me. She was on a mission to get me to read more stuff from Enid Blyton. She was very good at doing it. But I think she must have imagined that The Silver Chair was a standalone book. And in a way it is. It's quite possible. I'm the living proof that you can read it as a standalone book and pick stuff up as you go along. So I read them all out of order. It then depended on what I could find in the library or buy with my pocket money or what people gave me as birthday presents. But I've got some very, very clear memories of what I was doing and where I was and how I felt on some of the occasions when I first read, for example, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I can still feel this rather bristly armchair that I was sitting in with my legs curled up, sort of reading this book. And it turned out that although I've got what I really enjoyed about reading them was finding that a lot of the old magic still works. They're very, very rich books. And at some point, the comparison popped into my head that there's as much in the way of literary and cultural allusions in these books as T.S. Eliot packs into the wasteland. And it felt like this is the wasteland for children. And I think
I absolutely love that. That particular identification in the book.
And
makes sense.
The first time you read The Wasteland, you don't get a fraction of it. And I realized that when I was a child reading these books, I hadn't got a fraction of it, but that did not matter because they all work in that context. So you don't need to know that the Green Lady of the Silver Chair is effectively, she's a medieval figure. She's like from the medieval romances or from the ballads. You don't need to know that. You don't need to see any of these things to enjoy her. Anyway, it's an introduction to these figures when you come across them later.
Absolutely, absolutely. Excellent. Thank you so much for this, Katherine. And Rob, do you mind if I ask one more before I give you the floor? Because you already started sort of answering that, or actually you started talking about the order in which you read the books, and I'm sure all of us have different stories about how we came to the books. But there was the order in which you decided to sort of put the essays in your book. Was the internal chronology versus the publication order. And I've got a young child, as my son is reading all the Narnia books at the moment, and I decided to go with the publication order. And then I started reading your book and I was like, oh gosh, what have I done here? Is this the right way? You always agonize about these things. But yeah, I just wanted to ask a bit about why that decision, why go with internal chronology?
Well, first of all, I must say, I don't think there is a right way to read the Narnia books. And again, I think you can pick them up at almost any point and move backwards and forwards, and that's fine. But for the sake of a coherent critical work, which was, I mean, it is a critical work as much as a piece of memoir. I needed to get some sense into it. And I just feel that I wasn't really going to be looking at this from the point of view of Lewis's motivations or his growth as a writer. And I think he did grow as a writer, actually, as he was producing these books. I think that some of the later books are better written than some of the early books. I think
so more of a practical decision, really. Then
it wasn't that I was looking at that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I wanted to look at the literally pick out the source material and what he was doing with the source material, and if possible, why he was using it and what he was doing with it. And of course, not just literary source material, but also theological, on fairly
and contemporary children's literature and all sorts of things you bring in there. Yes, absolutely.
And philosophy. So, so it just seemed to make narrative sense to just go from the beginning of Narnia to the end of Narnia. Otherwise, you're always having to sort of jump backwards and forwards and say, oh, but he didn't write The Magician's Nephew until after the last battle, or didn't complete it anyway, and it just becomes a strange game of hopscotch. So yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
Also,
and actually,
sorry, I was just going to say. Also, apparently, Roger Lancelin Green asked Lewis in what order they should be read, and that was what he said. So I thought, fair enough.
That's fair enough. Absolutely fair enough. Yeah. Okay, Rob, do you want to have a go? Rob, you need to unmute yourself. We have to have one of those in every event, right?
Sure.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just going to say, I love the way, one of the things that your decision to write to, as it were, or in response to your 9-year-old self means that you are kind of liberated from solely being driven by source studies or by the need to contextualize Lewis. And I think that kind of magically kind of reanimates the books. Because they're directed at children, and you've really sort of put that across very strongly. It even made me start to wonder whether that's the only honest way of writing about children's books. You have to write about books you read as a child and remember how you read as a child, rather than trying to. Of course, that means that you can't write about modern children's books, which is rather a shame, unless you are a child. So yes, I wanted to ask about the type of fantasy that Lewis writes, and you do in fact bring out some. You make great use of your knowledge of the sources, thanks to your own medieval studies and the fact that you are in fact a medievalist. So you sort of you explore the sources for us. You reveal various sources that I'd never even thought about. But at the same time, there's a way that Lewis manages to put across the kind of emotional or the affective kind of qualities that are really necessary to a strong story. Do you think that the particular type of fantasy that Lewis writes is perfectly balanced or capable of accommodating both the kind of medieval sources and the affect? Is there something that he's able to do, which is capable of bringing those two very different kind of pleasures together?
Lewis's voice is, as I'm sure anybody who's read anything by him, is a very, very distinctive one. And I'm always struck by the fact that his voice is generally the same voice, whatever it is you're reading by him. He writes, it's the same person, it's the same voice talking to you, whether he's talking to you as a child in the Narnia stories, whether he's talking as a Christian apologist, or whether he's talking in his extremely readable literary criticism. So that's a unifying thing. And I think perhaps it's because I suspect he continued to read children's books. He, despite being this lofty Renaissance and medieval scholar and professor at Cambridge and so on and so forth, he never stopped reading children's books. I think he continued to read with a child's directness. And I think that's why he's so good at getting things over to children as well. He never talks down. Even Tolkien occasionally doesn't quite manage that, I think. There were the odd bits in The Hobbit, where I felt as though I was being a little bit patronised when I was a kid, and Lewis doesn't. And I think the medieval world, that the world of medieval literature has that same directness. A lot of medieval writing, I mean, I'm not saying it can't be subtle and it can't be extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? Sophisticated. But effectively what medieval stories and poems and romances are out to do is to tell you a story. And they tell you a story and they put in lots and lots of colour. And so I've always felt that reading Renaissance, well, even Renaissance literature, but certainly medieval literature is you've got these colours in your head. It's almost like having a medieval manuscript there. You can imagine the colours, and the world of Narnia is a little bit like that, I think. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think it's this sort of directness of perception that he has as to what's happening and what the important things are. And I think story was very important in him. And so I think there's that connection between the two.
I wonder if I could do what Dimitra did and sort of continue with the topic a little bit longer, because one of the wonderful things that you reveal to us in the book, and the book, I'm showing you the book again because it has this lovely picture that you drew on the basis of Pauline Baines on the cover. I mean, it's really good. I mean, you were 9 when you drew it, so it was absolutely amazing achievement. But I wondered whether one of the things that he does with Narnia that makes it so inviting for us to participate in creating it the way you did as a 9-year-old is to make sure that Narnia is always somewhere else. So it's kind of, we never get, we very rarely get sort of periods when we're solidly rooted in Narnia, but it's always buried under snow or a long way north over the desert or hidden in the past and having to be recovered. Do you think that that this process that one of the reasons why Lewis is such a powerful kind of figure for children to read is this invitation he offers to us to take part in desiring and kind of creating Narnia for ourselves because of this fact that it's always somewhere else?
Yes, I think that's very much the case. I was thinking along those lines, and I was thinking that in nearly all the books, Narnia is in some danger. There's an adventure, but basically, as soon as we get to the point in all the books where Narnia is restored or rescued, we get sent away. It's like the children have to leave. So does the reader. We never get to be there in Narnia's ordinary times. And in fact, I think that's why Jewel's accounts to Jill in the last battle, just before, is this wonderful poignant bit at the end, which is the lull before the storm, where they're hoping to meet Runwit the Centaur coming from Cair Paravel with reinforcements. And they know that it's a desperate case. They know that they don't have very much hope. And Jewel the unicorn starts to tell Jill about the long, peaceful history of Narnia, that sort of centuries and centuries of amazing, and we get these tiny little glimpses of, Swan White, the queen, whose reflection is so beautiful that when she looks into a pool, the reflection lasts in the pool for a year and a day. I mean, how elvish is that? Tolkien must have gone, darn, why didn't I think of that? And Moonwood the Hare, and I think in a couple of other books there's the 7 Brothers of Shuddering Wood and various glimpses of this great long history, but we never get to see it, and we never will. And I think Lewis is very, very good at taking us somewhere else and making that place seem very, very real. But but we can't stay there. And so it's this Sehnsucht again that he talks about in Surprised by Joy, this sense of longing that for him was the essence of everything he was talking about. He believed that somehow this sense of loss and longing and it's very Platonic again. It's if you long for something, it must exist. The very fact of longing for it, you couldn't long for something that doesn't exist, therefore this thing does exist, and therefore we'll get to it sometime, but not in any of the books. So yes, and that was almost unbearable as a child. We all wanted to stay there, to be there, to go there, to inhabit Narnia, and we never could. So writing my little stories was my attempt to do so, and of course it didn't work.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Rob, I think that's a good time to ask the Irish question, and then I'll go into one more from me, and then we can I can see already lots of questions in the Q&A, so I want to give enough space to our audience.
If you're going to ask me the Irish question, I've just got to nip into the next room and get my copy of Surprised by Joy, because I made a note. One moment.
Absolutely.
Go for it.
One of the great pleasures of Catherine's book is that she tells us about one of the stories that she wrote as a 9-year-old, which is based on that little collection of kind of unwritten Narnian short stories, which Jewel reveals to the children in the last battle. So if you want to know an extra story, then there's one in Spare Oom to War Drobe. So here's the book itself.
Yeah,
so I suppose I should ask the question before we.
Yes, to ask the question.
Which is yes. I'm actually. Oh, here we are. Yeah. I was very struck by how strongly you drew out Lewis's Irish inspirations from the big house that he lived in the environs of Belfast to Spenser's Irish epic, sometimes called The Fairy Queen, through the spectacular voyages of the Irish saints and heroes such as St. Brendan and Maelduin. How useful is it, do you think, to see him as an Irish writer?
Yes, it's not something that people tend to think of. He comes over this, he's got this image, hasn't he, of a sort of bluff pipe-smoking Englishman, but actually he was a bluff pipe-smoking Ulsterman. And I think it is interesting. It wasn't something that I came across these Irish connections. And when I was writing the chapter about Prince Caspian, it occurred to me, as it had not occurred before, that Aslan's Howl, which is what the stone table has become over the 1,000 years or whatever it is that's elapsed since the children were kings and queens of Narnia, it's now become this mound. And the way it's described is very, very clearly what's it called? The mound on the Boyne, the prehistoric mound on the Boyne, the name of which is completely escaped me at the moment, but which I visited a couple of years ago, and it's exactly as Lewis describes the Aslan's Howl. It's, rocks covered with spirals and strange inscriptions and passages reading underneath this Neolithic tomb. So there are all sorts of Irish connections. And I just think, again, I was thinking about this, and I thought, well, I'll go and remind myself of what he says about his childhood in Surprised by Joy. So he's talking about before his mother died. Every day there were what we call the Green Hills. That is the low line of the Castlereagh Hills, which we saw from the nursery windows. They were not very far off, but they were, to children, quite unattainable. They taught me longing, Sehnsucht. And then a couple of pages later, from our front door, we looked down over the wide fields to Belfast Lough and across it to the long mountain line of the Antrim shore, Divis Colin Cave Hill. This was in the far-off days when Britain was the world's carrier and the loch was full of shipping, a delight to both us boys, but most to my brother. The sound of a steamer's horn at night still conjures up my whole boyhood. And then he goes, behind the house, greener, lower and nearer than the Antrim Mountains were the Holywood Hills, but it wasn't till much later that they won my attention. The northwestern prospect was what mattered at first, the interminable summer sunsets behind the blue ridges, and the rooks flying home. In these surroundings, he continues, the blows of change began to fall. Because he goes on to talk about his mother's death. And so I think I've got the feeling that he kind of locked away the Irish, but it's there. He talked later about, although he talks lyrically about Lee House, Little Lee, at his boyhood home before his mother died. In a letter written, in his 60s, he told somebody that he could never think of that house without feeling the pains and pleasures of boyhood, and yet it had become a place that was intolerable to him. So I just feel as though he left Ireland behind him. It had too much pain associated with it, I think, perhaps rather as he locked away the war. But I don't think that means it's not there. I think it does come out.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Okay, I'm allowing myself one more, sorry, audience, and then we'll open it up. And that's, I presume that's a question that other people will want to ask anyway, so hopefully it'll be useful. But what I found fascinating is that the book both acknowledges the problematic aspects of Narnia, so the racism or Orientalism, the problem of Susan, all of these things that we've seen discussed a lot, but also sensitively, I thought at least, brings attention to the more sort of praiseworthy elements of Lewis's politics. So not underestimating the child reader, especially their potential to deal with big philosophical questions, or lots of feisty girls, as main characters. So did you envision this book as both a critique and a response to what you might see as very broad brush and perhaps rather unfair critiques of Lewis at the same time?
Yes, I think the Narnia series has been used as a bit of a punch bag for a while. And obviously, while it's useful and absolutely legitimate and definitely useful to point out problematic elements, which are really unmissable when you start to read them as an adult. And I've had some interesting comments from people. There's quite a lot of people who feel defensive about the Narnia books. I mean, on the one hand, you've got the camps that go, it's shocking, unforgivable Christian propaganda. And on the other hand, you've had, I suppose, quite devout Christians defending, or not even necessarily defending the books. And I'm not sure these two camps ever really meet, but extolling the books as wonderful, almost sort of like exemplars of how to live a Christian life. I think perhaps the literary side of the books has perhaps been a bit neglected, so I felt that there was a lot of scope there. And I do feel that some of the criticism has been unfair. I mean, I don't think the books are sexist. I never did think that. I thought, I've said in my book that when I was a child, it was fairly obvious that I was reading, well, let me see. So in the early 1960s, mid 1960s, most of the books I read, and I read an awful lot, you felt that if it wasn't about ballet or about a girls' school, the author, whoever he or she was, probably envisaged their child reader as a boy. And the way I got around this, and I think the way a number of other girls got around it, was to just shift persona, almost mentally shift gender and think, well, I'm going to read this as though I'm a boy. And then any sort of passing slur, like, almost as good as a boy, when you've got a heroine like you, she was almost as good as a boy, or she cried, don't be such a girl, all this kind of stuff. There was an awful lot of it. Cry like a girl, run like a girl, behave like a girl, and so on and so forth. And lots of girls who wanted to be boys. Not necessarily because boys are better than girls, but just because it was fairly obvious to most of us that the boys got the opportunities. So Lewis didn't do any of that. You know, Lucy is this shiningly good character whom he obviously really, really loves. And she's not really goody two-shoes either. She's quite capable of stamping her foot and being a bit awkward. You know, in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, she does some pretty dubious things with the Magician's Book. You know, almost if Aslan didn't stop her, she would have said the spell to make her beautiful beyond the lot of mortals and possibly brought ruin upon Narnia. It's an interesting book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because Aslan stops a whole bunch of the characters from doing things that they shouldn't. He passes along the hillside when Caspian's threatening his friends with death if they reveal the secret of Goldwater. If Aslan didn't pass along the hillside, Caspian might have become a much less kindly king than he ended up. So I'm not sure that there's blame attached to that, but it's definitely a message from Lewis that says, you know, not all my good characters are good all the time, and Lucy's not, but she's just wonderful. I mean, she's got this marvelous integrity, and she sees very clearly. Perhaps Lucy is a very good name for her. And Jill, of course, is practical and good at things, and is the one who releases Puzzle from the stable and can track. And Aravis is you know, wonderfully glamorous and rides a horse and has a sword, and you know, there was all this really, really, really interesting girl. And Polly, incidentally, Polly and Diggory doesn't get enough attention. You know, if you think about girls being emotional and boys being practical, well, Polly's the practical one and Diggory's the emotional one. She's the one that keeps him grounded. She's the one that sort of makes, you know, that criticizes him when he does stupid things. She's very supportive, but she's definitely the one that has the common sense. So there are these great characters, and so no, I don't think that the idea that boys are better than girls does not come into the Narnia books, and we could all see that. You know, we knew what we were reading.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Okay, right, so let's start having a look, because I can see lots of questions already, and I think the first one by David Bratman actually fits in with what we were just discussing, so it's a nice sort of transition. David is mentioning Laura Miller's The Magician's Book, and he's wondering how you feel about its extremely disillusioned view of Narnia.
Well, I read The Magician's Book when it first came out, which is about 10 years ago, I think. And I deliberately didn't reread it while I was writing this, because I didn't want to have her impressions sort of get in the way of mine. And I have to confess, I haven't actually reread it since. I've dipped in and out a tiny bit, but I haven't sat down and reread it. From memory, I would say that she's got a lot more biography of Lewis himself in there. I think she visits his childhood home and she visits his Oxford home, and there's quite a lot of, I think, sort of investigation into who he was and what he thought about things. I did enjoy the books very much. I mean, it is subtitled A Skeptic's Adventures in Narnia. I was impressed by her own description of her childhood desperation for Narnia to be real that she begins with. I thought that was lovely, and it completely rang true with me. I have to confess, I can't quite remember how she winds it up. I know she feels that I think she feels the books are more problematic than I do. I think she probably finds more to criticize. So we would probably have an interesting discussion if we met.
Fair enough.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Rob, do you want to ask the next one? Or yeah, can you unmute?
In some ways, so the second question is rather similar in that it's referring to a specific study, and it's asking if you because you mentioned Michael Ward a couple of times,
Yes.
but Catherine Butler is wondering if you steer clear of his planetary framework for the books deliberately, or again, what you think of Michael Ward's writing.
Oh, I think it's very interesting, and Michael's, been tremendously supportive to me. It's a fascinating theory. I didn't feel that it was somewhere I wanted to go with this book because it would have been difficult to have brought it in without an enormous digression in which I explained what Michael Ward does in Planet Narnia, which didn't seem appropriate anyway. And as I say, I was kind of avoiding most critical work on Lewis because this was so much a book about my own impressions. I didn't have to read particularly, I didn't have to really do very much research on the literary sources because I've been reading the same literary sources for the last 30, 40 years. So most of that was in my head. And I felt as though this was such a personal, I was writing such a personal account of the Narnia books, both for myself now and for my childhood self, that I probably would be better off if I didn't start having to feel as though I needed to take somebody else's opinion into account. That was one reason. The other reason was, Michael Ward may very well be right, but, and again, maybe one day we'll have an interesting discussion about this, but I find it quite difficult to believe that Lewis was that sort of writer. I don't really see him as the sort of writer who puts in hidden meaning, not that sort of hidden meaning anyway. I don't see him as the sort of writer who's constructing a puzzle which somebody can come and unlock. So I'm not entirely convinced. I'm sorry to say. Yeah.
That's fair enough, and it's interesting how that juxtaposes with the allegorical sort of elements, and you bring in Pilgrim's Progress quite a few times, but that is sort of never hidden away. I can see what you mean there about the theory that there's something that needs to be excavated and only a knowing reader would know. It seems like C.S. Lewis is a bit more transparent than that. He seems to be quite flaunting some of these elements.
I think he sometimes is, and then I think on other. I think yeah, definitely for Pilgrim's Progress and definitely for Paradise Lost, the comparisons are unmistakable. I think sometimes perhaps he was just so imbued with all this stuff himself that it just came out from his subconscious, perhaps.
Yeah. It's interesting that the Christian sort of message, which is the one that our students, Rob and I have had these discussions with our students many times, and that's the one that keeps on coming up. How much of that is an issue for non-Christian readers, for example, or how much of that is deliberate, which I think we're all pretty clear that it is up to a particular point, and how much does it sort of stop the enjoyment of the fantastic. But I was trying to reading your book, I was trying to pinpoint when did it click for me, because I grew up in a very Christian context, but not a Western. I was in a Greek Orthodox sort of context, which is very different. And I think it was at the Voyage of the Dawn Treader at the very end where Maslen says, I'm in all worlds, but I have another name. And then you're suddenly thinking, but who could you possibly be? And it sort of suddenly works. And interestingly, my son was just finished Dawn Treader, and he asked the exact same question. So who is he? He's like, you'll have to think about it. So very similar to your mother's question in some ways, but there we are. Okay, we've got an anonymous question here about, which is an interesting one, is what do you think the child you would think of the book? Do you think she would agree with your grown-up analysis? It's a very meta question, but it's an interesting one.
Yes, that point cropped up at a number of points through the book, as a matter of fact. Sometimes she would definitely disagree with me, and I've tried to point out a couple of those. I mean, I don't know if this, probably most of the people who are asking questions haven't read the book, but I was struck at the end of my chapter on the silver chair, where there is a slightly problematic, now I regard as slightly problematic moment when Aslan encourages Jill and Eustace and indeed Caspian to rush out on the bullies at Experiment House and thrash them with the blades of their, well, the flats of their swords, excuse me. And Jill has a riding crop, because doubtless a riding crop is more suitable for girls who use them sword, which is another bit of mild sexism, which I think perhaps is a bit silly. You know, and I, you know, it doesn't seem right now. And so I disapprove of it, you know, and I know I disapprove of it, but I know perfectly well that my childhood self was cheering them on, because adults used to say things like, oh, why don't you just stand up to them? Bullies are cowards. All you need to do is stand up to them, and then they'll back down, and you just need them. And so I was fully in favour of this, and I think that you know, I would get a bit of a look from 9-year-old me at that point, you know. And there were other moments like that as I was reading, but I think I mean, she is still me. It becomes very sort of weird talking about this person that I used to be, that's sort of still me there somewhere. And I think writers for children may be quite good at preserving the child within. And it probably is the person we write for when we're writing children's books. And I think she would be quite pleased. I'm pretty sure she was damn pleased when I started publishing children's books, because that's what I decided I wanted to do pretty much soon after reading, you know, the Narnia books for the first time. So, you know, hence, where is it?
Yeah, come on, show us a little bit. Oh, look at that.
That's what's it called? I can't. It's back to front as I'm looking at it, but. The story of King Gale, the news that Shirley brought, with lots and lots of bits lifted directly from the book. You know, people are always saying, "Why the lion's mane?" and with a good will, sire, and that kind of thing. And of course, I was copying Pauline Baines's illustrations. That's one of the that's a map of the Lone Islands, and somewhere or other. I mean, it's difficult to find. But I did find that writing about Narnia wasn't the same as reading about Narnia, and naturally I wasn't as good as C.S. Lewis, and I couldn't make it live for myself. But I did get the bug of writing stories, and I thought I wanted to write stories. So yeah, I think she would. What I think she would be pretty pleased about is the fact that we actually put some of her work into the
in the book itself. Yes, yeah. That was a lovely touch. Absolutely.
Yeah. The inside covers, which is quite nice. But no, we don't agree, and that was an interesting tension as I was writing it, to find places where, you know, I would find something that I didn't approve of, and I knew perfectly well that she just didn't care. So yeah.
Great stuff. Okay, there's a question from John Ratcliffe. Lots of Tolkienists and C.S. Lewis scholars around today, which is really nice. Who's actually asking a very practical question really here. Speaking of Lewis's continued reading of children's literature, because that's something that I love also about the book, Catherine, how many times you brought in Edith Nesbit, for example, you know, contemporary
and
children's.
George MacDonald, yeah,
exactly, yeah, and MacDonald. Has anyone done a study of C.S. Lewis like Holly Ordway's recent work on J.R.R. Tolkien? So is there, and I don't think, you know, I've been wrecking my brain while I was thinking about it. I don't think there is one systematic study that does it. I know that there's lots of different articles and different bits in books, but I don't think there is, unless I'm missing something here. Are you aware of any?
I'm not, no, I'm not. And I'm sure you probably are much more up to date with the articles than I am. But no, I'm not. I think if I had heard of such a thing, I would have probably tried to find
Yeah,
it.
you would have, that's what I was thinking. You would have probably corrected me here. I mean, the latest one I read and reviewed was a book on classical topologies and classical mythology and sort of texts in children's literature. And that traced the line from Edith Nesbit to C.S. Lewis to later texts, but it was very much focused on the classical context rather than any of the other, Celtic, Norse, etc. But yeah, I don't think there is, John. I think there's good scope there for a good systematic study, definitely.
It would be very interesting.
Yeah. Rob, do you want to have a go at the?
Yeah, I was going to say that following the line from the classical to the through Lewis might even be slightly misleading, since you bring out. I mean, obviously one could see the Voyage of the Dawn Treader as a profoundly Odyssean journey, but you bring out its Irishness as well. So I love the way you sort of question that. There's a wonderful question here which I wanted to ask, which is from Isabel Ferrari. And it's about a TV series. There's a rumor of a TV series adaptation of the Narnia series being developed by Netflix. And she says, what do you think should be the aspects that could most benefit from this type of adaptation? And what are conversely the things they should be careful of in their portrayal of the series? I really like that question. So.
Wow. Well, first I have to confess but apart from going to see the film of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe when it first came out, I haven't seen any of the films, and I haven't seen any of the TV adaptations. And I know, Dimitra, you were looking at these with your son recently, and I think you saw the.
That was my introduction, because they were broadcast in Greece when I was a child with subtitles, and that was how I got wind of all of this.
So my reason for not doing this would be mainly because I've got such vivid pictures in my head of everything that's happening. And also, thank you, Pauline Baines, for doing these amazing, iconic illustrations. I can't quite imagine the characters, and particularly some of the characters like Puddleglum or Reepicheep, outside of her drawings. So I've never wanted to own a copy of any of the Narnia books that didn't have her illustrations on the front. So I may not be the right person to ask, but I would like, and because I don't, having not seen really any of the others, I don't know whether this has been the case. I think I would like to see adaptations that preserved the romance and the poetry and the lyricism of the books, in a way that, I mean, I think the adaptation of The Lord of the Rings really managed to do that very, very well. I know there were criticisms, and I know there were people who didn't like them because they weren't absolutely sticking to completely what the books were. I understand that in a film you've got to do different things, but when the films of The Lord of the Rings came out, which is probably again about at least 10 years ago now, isn't it? I was a bit dubious, but they did a marvelous job. But they took years to film those, and it was a labor of love. And so I would hope that whoever it is that's doing this for Netflix, A, really, really loves the books, and they probably do, and B, they'll have the budget and the time to put forward, to sort of somehow bring in the it's the lyrical quality of the books that I loved. It was I think Philip Pullman says somewhere, I mean, he's not very fond of the Narnia books, and in some article for The Guardian, a long time ago, in 1998, which is a very long time ago, and I'm not sure if I've been entirely fair to him in using him as a sort of spokesperson for the prosecution, if you like. But he talks of how Lewis can tell a story in a rather not trivial, but what's the word? Not deep, but the other word. I lost the word. He can tell a story.
Superficial
way. Thank you. Yeah, in a rather superficial way, and that carries children along. But there have always been adults who suspect what he was up to, and I thought, well, yes, I enjoyed Lewis's storytelling, which I think is very good. But that wasn't why I read the books. I read the books for these conjurations of wonderful places that he's so very, very good at doing, these magical places. The moment when the children leap onto Aslan's back after he's come back to life. And then there's this marvelous, breathtaking gallop that Aslan takes them across the hills and downs and up through the woods and over the mountains of Narnia to find the White Witch's castle and start putting her evil magic to rights by turning the stone statue back into live animals. And the cadences of that writing sweep you along. It's about 5 or 6 lines without a full stop. I can't quote it from memory, but it's something like, imagine yourself on a horse and then take away the horse's mane and take away the jingle of the bridle and the saddle and the thud of the hooves. Now imagine you're on Aslan's back and you're riding not sort of across some English down, but sort of up through Narnia in the spring, through pine woods on gusty heights and down through acres of bluebells and up again over sort of high mountains and down, and you just swept along with this. And I just wanted to be there. I wanted to be on that lion's back, and that moment of the sense of the physicality of Narnia as a place, an absolutely beautiful place that I wanted to be. And it doesn't have to be beautiful, because the black sky and the ruins and the red, slowly sinking sun of Charn is equally evocative and in a rather terrifying way. But he could do this amazing writing that just puts you into a place where you wanted to be. And so, but I'm sure they can do this. There's some very, very talented people working on these things. But that's what I would like. I would like the magic. I would like the lyricism of the books to be somehow portrayed.
It's also sometimes it has to do with what people have sort of grown up with, and for me the old BBC series was such a introduction into a world of a literary world that I didn't know anything about, and I did find eventually I think I read all of the Narnia books in Greek first, in Greek translation, apart from The Last Battle, which never got translated. I don't know why. And then I found that many years later and read it as an adult. But there's, although the costumes and all the props are so transparent, you can see the mechanics of it so well. It's still the one that does it for me. There is something about those performances, and that, lots of Shakespearean actors as well, that makes a heck of a difference, and much closer to the plot as you'd know it in the books. But there we are. Yeah, I digress. Let me ask the next question, which is really about it is about the magic in some ways. So it follows on quite nicely from what you were saying. It's quite a long one, so I'll try to summarize. It's really a question about the transition from this world to a magical world and how that happens. You follow this line about houses and labyrinthine, maze-like houses, and how this image is there in all of the Narnia books. I thought that worked beautifully in the book and as a thread and as an argument. But it's the question of, how do you go from one place to the other, and that's from, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Viper, who's talking about how we have the War Drobe, of course, we have other transitions too. There is a painting, there are rings, there's something interesting about what makes a portal in C.S. Lewis, and he or she are also bringing up Coraline and Gaiman's works of doors and portals and passages and houses, and how those work in the sort of construction of the fantastic. As I said, it's quite a long question, but I think it's really about how the architectural structure of the door leads us into that mythopoeic fantasy.
Yes, I mean, Lewis is endlessly inventive in his portals. I mean, I'm in awe. Every single one is different. Well, nearly every single one. I think Lucy goes through the wardrobe a few times and nobody does that. I don't think, I might be wrong about this, but I don't think anybody, apart from the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, I don't think anybody comes back to Narnia the same way they went. The picture in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader has a this didn't get into the book because it was something that somebody pointed out on Twitter, actually, sort of much more recently. There's a Japanese story about an artist and Buddhist monk who has is a wonderful painter and is called before the shogun to exhibit his wonderful painting of 7 folding screens, upon which is a view of a lake. And as they watch, the shogun and his court are standing looking at this screen with this lake on it. They notice that there's a little boat far off on the lake, and the little boat is getting closer, and it gets closer, and it gets closer. And then they see that there's a man rowing the boat, and then water starts to flow out of the painting and to fill up the room. And they're all getting wet. And the Buddhist monk and artist then climbs into the boat and is rowed off into the painting, and the water sort of vanishes. And I thought,
Wow.
well, that's Lafcadio Hearn. And I was wondering whether Lewis might have come across that, because there's this bit about a great salt splash coming out of the painting in the children's bedroom. So there's all sorts of things he does, and some of them are doubtless borrowed, and some of them are, but we all borrow all the time. So, I mean, yes, there are a lot of doors, and there's the door doors are the easiest and most obvious portals, but it was also the what you find behind the doors, and there's nearly always a hidden or forbidden room. And of course, this goes beyond any individual writer. This is a very, very deep sort of human psychological thing, I think, that, you know, Lewis talks about hidden rooms and houses, not only in his children's writing, but in all his writing. He talks about it as, he talks about books as doorways into other worlds. He talks about the different Christian faiths as doorways, basically in Mere Christianity, which was his I think wartime book, or just after the war it was published. It was based on a series of lectures that he was invited to do by the BBC, because they wanted something for servicemen that would not be either Catholic or Protestant. They just wanted a layman to do it, rather than asking a particular head of a particular church. And so that's, I'm sure you all know this. But he talks in the introduction, or the introductory chapter of Mere Christianity, that the basic Christian faith is a hallway, and you shouldn't stay there, because there are lots of doors, and you've got to find the door that's right for you, and that will be the faith that you then take up, or the denomination that you take up. But then you get doorways and fairy tales as well. You get trapdoors and doorways and hidden rooms. You've got the Sleeping Beauty, climbing up the stairs to the tower room where there's the woman, and that's the same image as you get in George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, and Lucy running through the house trying to find, the children exploring the almost empty house in, well, I suppose it's not empty actually, but they find the empty room with the wardrobe in it, and that's the doorway through. And indeed, in George MacDonald's adult fantasy, Lilith. There's another, again, it's a labyrinthian house with mysterious rooms and attics, and you need to explore them and find out where you're going to end up. So, I mean, we could probably talk about this all night.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And I wish we were all together and everybody could interrupt me and give me their own ideas, because I think it would be very interesting. But...
Oh, they're all typing away on the chat. I'm going to try and save it all for you so that you can have a good look at the end. Okay, we've got a question from Eric, who actually has done a lot of work with Tolkien's illustrations and maps, who's really liked your map drawings that you showed us. And it'll be nice to actually see a few more. He was asking about what other maps you made as a child or later, and was it just Narnia, or did you double with fantastic maps of other places as well? And what about your books?
Yeah, well, I think I saw somebody in the comments saying a proper fantasy book has to have a map. And I feel that it should. I mean, Tolkien does it, Lewis did it, or, you know, if Lewis did not do it, Pauline Baynes did it for him. So this is, if I can show you this, that's my,
Wow.
there's ink being spilt on it in various bits. This is very, very fragile piece of paper. It's on the back of something that my father was doing in the 1960s with lots of figures on the back. This is another one. That's a colour one of, again, has obviously been spilt ink on it at some point.
Yeah.
When I started writing fantasy, and I wrote a number of fantasies that weren't very good and didn't get published, I did feel that I should draw a map to give myself some sense of where things were in relation to one another. And I've done that for all my fantasies so far, but I haven't got any of them to hand, so I can't show you them now. I'll sort of, yeah, I think, you know, it's good. Then the act of map drawing makes the world that you're writing about more concrete. And the qualities I've always enjoyed about particularly J.R.R. Tolkien, but also Lewis, is this sense of the physicality of the world. And I always felt that you could dig a hole in the ground. You know, you could walk into Middle Earth and you know you can dig a hole in the ground, and there will be lots of solid earth below that. You're not going to fall through, which was never the case, I have to say, for the Covenant, was it Thomas Covenant Unbeliever? I've forgotten who the writer was. Those always seemed to me to be very, very sort of tissue paper worlds. I never quite believed in them. I didn't really take to them. It all seemed a bit airy-fairy. I think maps, if you've got a map in your head, you probably are going to make fewer mistakes about what your characters do and where they're going. And I did catch Lewis out on one occasion. I've got a feeling, I mean, obviously Tolkien was irritated by Lewis's, what he regarded as rather slapdash approach to writing fantasy. I mean, goodness sakes, he wrote all 7 Narnia books within the space of 5 years, during which he was also compiling English literature in the 16th century for Oxford University, was it Cambridge University Press? And doubtless sort of tutoring and probably writing other things as well. I have no idea how he did it. So he wasn't approaching it the same way that Tolkien did. And I'm sorry that annoyed Tolkien, but I don't think Lewis could have done it any other way. But so obviously Pauline Baynes drew maps. I don't know, and possibly somebody here might be able to tell me whether Lewis ever drew a map of Narnia himself, or whether he just kind of winged it. And I'm pretty sure he was winging it when we got to the last battle.
I remember a Boxen map, and that's on the cover of the Juvenilia stories. But to be honest, I don't remember a hand-drawn Narnia map.
Well, we will perhaps never know. But in the last battle, he's got Tyrion, who's a splendid figure, but not a very competent ruler, I don't think, who is taking Eustace and Jill through Lantern Waste up to a point where there's a watchtower, which it turns out is stuffed with suits of Calaman armor, very conveniently, because they can dress up as Calamans. And he says something that I didn't particularly notice, this being weird as a child. "Ah, lad, I keep these suits of armor here in case I should ever desire to go into Calaman in disguise."
It's way too convenient.
It's the total wrong end of Narnia. I mean, you can't get further away from Calaman and still be in Narnia. So if it was to be of any use, it should have been down by the southern border. And I just think that Lewis didn't really have that clear an idea of where things were. to be honest.
Or I think you were making a really good argument in that particular chapter that he has a very specific aim, and everything is falling under, everything else is sacrificed to achieve that particular aim in that book.
Yeah.
I mean, I reread The Last Battle after many, many years. As I said, I only read it as an adult, and it's the one that in shock, I'm realizing it's the one I had never returned to. I think it just left a bitter taste. A lot of your discussion of it really chimed with my impression of it, and I just couldn't face it again, I think. And of course now, I did very deliberately this reread, as you say, with my little one, and I decided I'm going to go to the bitter end and read them all again. But it's fascinating.
It's still a very difficult book to read. I think it was always a difficult book to read. It was the one I read the least of Narnia books, and it remained in better condition for that reason. And it's a difficult book for a child to read because things keep going wrong. Everything goes wrong, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And then there's the bit where the horses get shot.
I know, that's horrible.
And it's like, well, when is something nice going to happen? And in the end, it sort of does, but I was never really convinced by it. Not everybody feels like this. I know there are people who really feel that it succeeds, but I never did, and I still don't. So
yeah, I completely sympathize with that. I'm going to move to Dia's question, which is, I think so. She's asking if you had to meet one person who wrote a children's or fantasy book series, who would you meet and why? I presume they're talking about people from the past, because I'm sure you've met lots of contemporary children's fantasy authors, or quite a few people. But who would you like? Would you want to meet C.S. Lewis? Would it be Nesbit? Who would it be?
That's a really interesting question, actually. When I was 9, I would have loved to meet C.S. Lewis, but I suspect that if I had, it would have been a terrible disappointment. I didn't have any, mainly because I didn't have any picture in my head of what he looked like or anything. And I don't think children necessarily do. I do wish I'd written to him, because I now realise that had I written to him, he would have probably written back. I think he was probably still alive when I first read the first one. He didn't last very long. Maybe he wasn't. So would I want to meet Lewis now? Yes, I think I would want to meet him now as an adult, because if he was prepared to talk to me about Narnia, we would sit down and talk about Narnia. But if the question was any writer other than C.S. Lewis, I think I might have to say Ursula Le Guin, actually. I would love to have, she would be a really, really interesting person to talk to. Only I think that it couldn't be a short conversation. I think somehow or other I'd need to be, invited by some miracle to sort of stay with her for a week, and, on the northwest coast, and sort of go for walks and talk and talk and talk. I don't think a short conversation would
one meeting would never do it, would it? Yeah, no, you're right. You're right there. There's one more question from Caroline about just quickly following up on the maps, where she's wondering about how the whole fantasy map thing might change or might be influenced by the fact that younger generations are grown up with mobiles and sort of maps on GPS and sort of thinking of maps in a different way, which is an interesting one. I hadn't really thought about this, to be honest. Any comment on that?
I think maps are interesting things in themselves. I mean, I think I could imagine there being some sort of app which would start as a map of Narnia, and then you could zoom in on places and sort of see them brought to life. I think that would be quite fascinating, actually, especially if you could flick through time and see how Narnia changed. The interesting comparisons between the map at the beginning of the Land, the Witch and the War Drobe, and the map for Prince Caspian, in which various landmarks have altered.
Yeah.
It would be interesting. And that could be a very, very fascinating thing. I mean, it could be a brilliant game, as a matter of fact. How do you
Absolutely,
get there? Can you convince a flying horse to give you a lift, or something like that? Would be fascinating.
So the digital could actually enhance the experience rather than just.
I think a living map would be quite interesting, actually. Only you couldn't get beyond the wave at the end of the world. That would be. I think it would be a bit much to sort of take you over the wave into Aslan's. I suspect you'd have to stay where you were.
Yeah.
My phone is ringing for some reason, so I'm going to shut the door.
Yes, absolutely. Go for it. Okay, so just to picking up on that, in the Tolkien exhibition in the Bodleian, there was a lovely 3D map in which you could press different buttons and you could see different routes of different people of the Fellowship on the map and sort of pick up the different journeys, and that was a lovely experience. So something like this would be great, definitely. One more that hasn't come up in the Q&A, but I spotted it in the chat. Naughty should have been. It's about food in Narnia, actually, and that's something that our Discord members, we have a Discord community where, with lots of students and early career researchers and old geezers like me. I feel very old in that community anyway. We're talking about how food is used in Narnia, and you pick up on that as well. How in The Lion, the Witch, and the War Drobe, it all seems, there's not much explanation of how, particular British products find their way in Narnia, but later on it seems like he's thought about this through a bit more. Do you want to talk us through a little bit about food? Because I'm just realizing we're in the last 9 minutes or so.
Oh my goodness. Well, yes, I mean, I think Lewis is on record as having said in one of his essays, actually, on fairy stories or possibly writing for children, 3 ways of writing for children, that somebody had said to him, "Oh well, of course you can't put sex into a book like that, can you? But
I remember that one. Yep.
You could put food in because the little beggars like the food." He said, "No, I put the food in because I like the food," and he obviously does. So he's definitely. He obviously likes marmalade rolls, and who wouldn't? It sounds like sticky toffee pudding, and it sounds rather nice. Yes, it's when you've got the food in The Lion, the Witch, and the War Drobe. I think we're definitely in animal land, and you're not supposed to figure out how the food gets there. One of the bits about food that I've always rather liked was the bit at the end of Prince Caspian where you get told what the trees eat, and there's like I think there's a sort of a rich dark loam that's very much like chocolate mousse, and sort of a few sort of gritty gravels that sort of take the like a cheese course. And he's always thought very hard about how trees might appreciate the earth that they taste. He's a very physical writer. Right the way through, he's very, very aware of what it feels like to be a horse, for example. He never makes the mistake that sometimes people do of writing about animals and then saying that they grin, for example. Animals, unless you're a crocodile, they don't grin. But sometimes that happens. He never does that. Bree is always turning his neck round and craning his neck and pricking his ears and that kind of thing. But I'm getting off the subject of food. The centaurs at that banquet bring oats and also wine. So that's sort of the horsey side and the Greek side, the wine, because they're classical creatures, of course we're going to bring wine, but they also bring oat cakes, which is a sop to their horsey side. And then, of course, in The Horse and His Boy, one of the few good things we get told about Calaman is the amazing food that Shastra is given, mistaken for his twin brother, Corin, sort of snatched off the streets of Tashbaan and taken to be given iced sherbets and what is quite clearly a pilaf, sort of a rice dish with chicken livers and chopped chopped nuts and raisins and things. And I was reading this thinking, my goodness, this was written in sort of 1952 or something like that. Where was he coming across this food? And then a writer, Barney Capaldi, who's a poet, got in touch to say that their parents knew of Indian restaurants on the, somewhere in Oxford, in the centre of Oxford. And it was quite, because I was a country girl. I didn't live in a town, and very rarely have. But apparently, if you lived in a town like Oxford, you could come across this sort of food, and I dare say they tried it. But it sounds absolutely delicious.
Totally.
And yet, you note that the circumstances in which he is eating this delicious Eastern food are also circumstances of temptation, because he's tempted to continue pretending that he's this prince and go off with the Narnians to Narnia and leave his friends behind. And in the same way that Edmund is tempted by the Turkish delight. So there's something going on there. It's not quite what it seems, I think. And again, I wouldn't say if that was conscious or unconscious.
Yeah. There's definitely this juxtaposition between sort of Western or even particularly British food versus exotic food, and there has been work, research done and written on this, especially from a sort of post-colonial perspective, for sure. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Great. Okay, I'm just realizing, I mean, Katherine, you must be exhausted now. I know these events, we say an hour and a half, and usually towards the end, we're all hanging there, sort of getting very, very tired, speaking for quite a long time. But you've given us all of that time, and we're very, very grateful for it. There are a few more questions that I don't think we'll have time to get to, but Katherine is on Twitter, so please feel free to sort of get in touch in that way. And also somebody was asking on the chat about the Centre Discord community, and I've put links to that there. So I just want to sort of end by, first of all, thanking Katherine for her all of her wisdom and her time, and talking to us about all of those decisions and the thinking behind the book, and bringing back that joy of reading Narnia, especially after, I think, a whole generation of fantasy writers who mostly were critical. And I think, you've sort of done something here, Katherine, sort of turned the tide a bit. I think it had gone too much one way, and it's good to hear the other side as well.
There were a couple of forerunners as well in Francis Spufford, who obviously loved the boy, and Lucy Mangan praises it too in Bookworm, which are two wonderful books. The Child That Books Builds in Bookworm.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Thank you. And just to say to all of our attendees, thank you so much for joining us from all over the world, actually, as usual. These are very global events. And I will put on the chat just one last time links for those of you who want to keep in touch with the centre, or you want to know what we might be doing next. You might want to be involved in our social media groups, or as I said before, our Discord community will be part of our newsletter, and we will find an excuse to get Katherine back again. We'll find a way, because there's still so much to discuss. I think Rob, would you like to add anything before we?
Only that I hope the next time will be in person. Yes. We're all hoping for that, aren't we?
Yes.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
And we're investing in technology to be able to do events that we are sort of in person. Some of us are in person, but others can also join us online. So fingers crossed, all of those plans will come to fruition. So there we go. Okay, so once more, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Katherine, for your time and for all of these lovely sharing all of these lovely thoughts and ideas, and your drawings and your childhood sort of writings, and the materiality of your engagement with Narnia. And we can't have the roaring applause, which is very, very frustrating in these online events. But you will see on the chat, it's just jumping around with lots of thank yous and
it's been a great pleasure and an honour to be invited, and I've really enjoyed it. And I could probably go on talking about Narnia all night, but
same here. There we go. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to close here, and I'm going to just close this room now, and the live streaming will close at the same time. But as I said, hopefully we'll get to see you all, including Katherine, at some other point in the future. Thank you all very much,
Thank you so
and
much.
have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine.